Hey everyone, I'm Joe Berzesi. I'm a general partner at RW3 Ventures, which is an early stage Web3 venture fund. I'm really excited to be joined here by Luigi. I have a long history with Avalanche, was actually one of their first advisors, so I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. So to get started, Luigi, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, your background, and what your current role at Avalabs is.
Great, thanks, Joe, and it's great to be here with everybody. Yeah, my background is similar to I think a lot of people in this room in certain aspects. I started my career in traditional finance. Worked at Citi for about 6 years or so, mainly on the trading side of the business there, on credit and equity products. But ultimately, was pretty interested in crypto back in 2011. Managed to not get rugged by Mt. Gox. Was pretty interested in the Bitcoin white paper and started to follow it thereafter. But ultimately, my interest grew a little bit deeper when Ethereum came around, and I got pretty embedded into that ecosystem. I ended up building and running a startup in 2017 through 2019. Basically, I tell people I tried to build consumer crypto before there was a DEX that was live, so I was a little early. It's still a little early. And I learned a lot through that process. I looked at different types of blockchains, looked into different type of scalability, privacy things, and I think through that process is where I really learned a lot about some of the issues of what one might encounter in building in this space. So after that, when DeFi was something that really started to bloom in late 2019 and 2020, this was like very emblematic of my background, given the markets and crypto nature. And I started to get very deep into different DeFi protocols, and ended up getting brought to Avalabs back in early 2021. So it's close to 4 years now that I've been here. Spent a lot of time on the DeFi side of things. Also helped build the developer relations team there, and most recently, I think earlier this year, took on the role of COO. So it's been an interesting journey, but that's been sort of the progression.
That's awesome. Congrats on the COO role. One of the things I think is going on is we all hear a lot about Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana kind of as the big three. I think each of them kind of has unique things going on, but Avalanche, I think, very quietly has some of the most interesting builds happening on it. So how do you help people think about, if they don't know, like what is Avalanche and what makes it unique relative to everything else out there in the market?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I do get that question a lot, depending on sort of the different conferences that I go to. But I think Avalanche is known for a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people. There's sort of this early 2020, 2019 crowd who knows all about the new consensus mechanism that it brought to market, the Avalanche consensus. And then there's another crowd in like 2021, 2022 that remembers a lot of the DeFi activity that was pretty prevalent on Avalanche. And then there's just a crowd that sort of hasn't really been indoctrinated with what's going on there. So I think just to give everybody a little bit of a sense, what Avalanche is building is basically a network of networks, basically a chain that allows anybody to deploy their own L1 blockchain to be interconnected, to be cheap, to be fast, and also have a public hub that anybody can connect to that has all the integrations, everything out of the box. So we're basically building a network that allows anybody to deploy their own chain with their own rules, with their own community. And with that, they get to save on some of the cost of what it takes to actually launch their own chain. So some of the things that might make sense in terms of depending on your how deep you are on a technical level, but Avalanche sort of allows any virtual machine to be deployed. So whether or not you want to build a chain that uses the Solana virtual machine, SVM, or the Ethereum virtual machine, the EVM, or the Move virtual machine, all those things can be built on this network as their own chains, but have native interoperability between them. They can all speak and communicate and send messages to each other. So it allows for this very clean architecture that simply just works. And we've had a number of different sort of real-world use cases and different types of opportunities deployed on Avalanche the last few years that I think it has a little bit of a different flavor than what you're seeing in others in the space.
So it's an interesting idea on the network of networks. I think we all live in a world where the thought process has been that blockchains are going to scale via L2s, at least within the Ethereum ecosystem. I mean, there's been tons of L2s deployed. There's a lot of hype around L2s. Why does someone launch an L1? I think this is like something a lot of people are curious about. If I was a brand new builder of a really interesting application, could be gaming or anything else, why would I launch an L1 on top of Avalanche rather than an L2 on top of Ethereum, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you really go back, it all started with L1s with Cosmos first, right? Cosmos has kind of been the one that's trailblazed a lot of the sort of, whether you want to call them app chains or, sort of purpose-built chains, and then sort of the Ethereum L2, narrative as well started to take off. It's really a technical difference in terms of the design, right? If you're deploying an L2, you're building on somebody else's infrastructure. You don't have fixed costs. You have variable costs. So, if the data layer that you're settling upon is super clogged or, has a bunch of activity going on, you need to pass those costs on to your users. That's decidedly different than launching an L1 where you don't pass any of those costs on to your users. So depending on what I always like to tell people is if you'd like to use an analogy, one thing that you could say to yourself is, an L2 might be more beneficial if you're in like the WeWork stage of your infancy. You need to pay a higher price per square foot because you really don't have product market fit yet. You don't know if you're going to be around. But once you do know you're going to be around, you go and get your own office space. You lower your price per square foot, and you don't have to have so much dependency on somebody else out there. So I think that's a technical difference, and it's an economic difference. One other point that I think is interesting that is not yet discussed, but will be discussed, in my opinion, in the future, is that the L2 design inherently creates sort of a lot of contagion risks. Everything is interdependent, and so the more you build in that type of fashion, the more you risk sort of black swan events. If there is an issue with the underlying L1 that everything is settling to, the L2s will also be passed on that risk as well. So that's something that people will not think about until it happens, but I think it's something from an architectural standpoint that does carry some risks, and that's decidedly different than the L1 architecture, which you have your own chain with your own rules.
Listen, I don't want to steal your thunder on this. There's a lot of really interesting things happening on Avalanche. I think one of the cool things is you guys have both a combination of kind of native crypto things happening. There's a lot of traditional people building on your chain. I think a lot of it has largely been experimental, correct me if I'm wrong. But with what happened with the election last night, I think maybe this opens the spigots for people to really start diving into the space. What's your perspective on what just happened with the election, how this kind of plays into what's going on in your ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, rather not get political, but I think, it's been clear that there's been a lot of uncertainty in this space from a regulatory perspective. I don't think that's all that remarkable of a statement. I would say that, I could tell an interesting story, actually. We've worked with a number of U.S. banks on different, pilots, POCs, different types of initiatives. And I could tell you, we had a call with one of them, probably a month after FTX collapsed, and we had a really interesting pilot that we were working on with them. It was actually one that was slated to go into production, and ultimately they told us on the call a month after FTX that they were doing a full stop with everything. And, that's something that is tangible, right? You worked on something for a long time, you put resources, there's a lot of mental energy in something, and it just goes to a full stop. So, sometimes it could feel like it's rhetoric, but it's actually not. And I think the one thing out of this election that could be beneficial is that, hopefully it leads to some regulatory, clarity in some form or fashion. And I do think, because it looks like we're going to have, House, Senate, presidency that is generally aligned, there's a window to do something interesting. And when there's a window to do something interesting, a lot of these pilots and POCs turn into something that can become tangible. One of the biggest issues that we faced on the institutional side, for example, is a lot of these institutions weren't able to hold any crypto on their balance sheets. They're heavily penalized, even stable coins, right? That counts as crypto as well. And if you can't carry stablecoins, then you can't do any interesting cross-border stuff. You can't do and enter into the payment space, and that presents real challenges for getting this technology adopted as the next financial rails. So I would say I do expect this election to lead to an opening on the institutional side of things in particular, although I would caution that those things will take time. Outside of that, I'm really excited about a number of different verticals. We have a lot of success on the gaming side. Recently, there's been a game that went live on Avalanche in early October called Off the Grid. It's a PlayStation, Xbox, and PC game. I think right now it's almost at 10 million users that have been created there, and about I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but 700 to a million daily active users. And all those people are using crypto and don't even know it. They're owning their in-game assets. They're trading them. They're generating revenue for a gaming studio in a different way. And that's ultimately the most interesting thing that the space can do. Like, bring new forms of revenue to companies. That'll bring more, Web 2 and traditional parties to be interested in using the technology versus just, hey, here's some new operational infrastructure that you could use, rip and replace what you have. We need people to build new businesses. So that's been a really interesting use case on Avalanche, and I think there's a number of others that we can get into, but just to give a little bit of a flavor.
I think the gaming example is really exciting. Can you highlight a few of the institutional partnerships you guys have? I think more than any other chain, you probably have more real institutions building on Avalanche than anyone. So what are a few that you're really proud of?
Yeah, there's a number of ones. We last year at the Singapore FinTech Festival, we announced two. One with Citigroup, where they built a foreign exchange RFQ pilot, which basically sort of used a bunch of different, what were formerly called subnets, but are now called Avalanche9000s, to basically build an RFQ system. And if you think about it, and if you understand how traditional finance works on the trading side, most RFQ trades go through a platform like Bloomberg or Tradeweb, and they're simply just a middleware. And I think what this ultimately tried to do is remove that, frankly. And so the disintermediation was one of the original theses of this technology, and that was a really good use case for that. On top of that, there was also a really interesting use case we did with JP Morgan and Apollo. It was called Crescendo, and it was basically doing alternative assets and creating those and tokenizing them and leading into a bunch of operational efficiencies that could be gained. More recently, actually last night, also at Singapore FinTech Festival, JP Morgan released an interesting paper that highlights a bunch of different privacy use cases. One of those is the new AvaCloud use case that basically enables auditable but private transactions on a blockchain using an EVM and an ERC20 token. So basically, I could send you a token. You don't have to know my address. I don't have to know your address. But if we need to retroactively audit it, that can be done. That's new technology that's just being built that ultimately, in my opinion, these are the building blocks that are actually stopping some of the adoption on the payment side, on the institutional side. One of the biggest, I guess, complaints we've got on the institutional side has been privacy. Front running, not knowing somebody else's sort of trading flow. It's one thing to have sort of like an SDR where trades are posted after the fact. It's another for me to be able to monitor a mempool and understand what you're trading as my competitor, right? Like, that is not going to ever make it in traditional finance. So this type of privacy technology, in my opinion, is just is something that can unlock a lot of different use cases, whether or not on the retail and payment side and also on the institutional side.
So I think now that we've set the stage for what is Avalanche, what are Avalanche L1s, who's building on it, why does it matter? There's a lot of talk about Avalanche9000, which I know was kind of the topic of this panel. So can you set the stage for the audience? What is Avalanche9000? Why are people excited about it? And kind of what are the core things that it's going to do for the ecosystem?
Yeah, so Avalanche9000 is probably the largest upgrade of the Avalanche network in the roughly 4 years of its existence. Basically, what is happening is Avalanche previously had an architecture whereby it was super expensive to launch your own L1 blockchain. The reason for that was there was a staking requirement where you had to stake on the primary network as well. That was also an inhibitor for institutional use cases, since institutions did not want to validate a public chain as a prerequisite to launching their own chain. And so what Avalanche9000 does is it removes those requirements and instead brings in and introduces a pay-as-you-go model for validators to launch chains. So basically, we're taking the cost down for all Avalanche L1s to, I think Blockworks did a recent report about this. That basically makes it one of the most cost-efficient ways to launch your own blockchain. It compared it with Cosmos chains, L2s, also Celestia data availability layers, and this was the cheapest potential chain to launch. And so I think, with Avalanche9000, we're actually increasing the accessibility to this technology. Right now on mainnet, there's about 42 what were previously called subnets are now called Avalanche L1s on mainnet. There's about 150 on testnet, and all of that is without this 9,000 upgrade live. That 9,000 upgrade is going live in the next month or so, and like I said, really reduces the barrier to entry to these L1s. So at the end of the day, what you're going to have is a network that has really cheap to launch chains that are out of the box, interoperable, completely sovereign, and have access to a bunch of integrations via public chain on the C chain. So I think we're in a really good spot to introduce a new upgrade. In addition, in the Avalanche9000, there's also a large fee reduction happening on the public chain, the C chain as well. Through a number of technological upgrades we've had, that's now able to happen. So this will be a chain that will be basically as cheap as Polygon or an Arbitrum, but with a validator set that's 1,500. And so it's a completely decentralized network versus an L2.
How do you think about public participation in all of this? Like if I look at Gunzilla or some of these other L1s that are launching, is there opportunity for people to actually validate them? Like who's running these nodes? Like is it really going to be decentralized? You say there's 1,500 validators on Avalanche right now, but is there really room for external people to participate, or are really the people who are building these chains just running their own nodes?
It's a really good question, Joe, and the thesis in a lot of ways for Avalanche9000 is that we do think there are going to be permissionless chains. Right now, it's not possible to launch a permissionless chain on Avalanche, like your own L1. Avalanche9000 also enables that, and so that will dramatically, I think, increase the number of validators, which thereby increases the number of sort of AVAX that gets burned from that mechanism. But the reality is that I think we're going to have sort of this like walk, jog, run, when it comes to decentralization. You have a Gunzilla, which doesn't have a bunch of nodes. They want to control some part of their stack. Part of that is regulatory, part of that is not. And the only reason somebody would decentralize is, one, because they want to build a very robust community, two, because they want decentralization and regulatory unlock, or three, because they want additional security. And I think, we've talked to a number of different teams building L1s who are very interested in having robust and decentralized validator sets. I got off the phone with one 2 days ago that is looking to do a 1,000 validator set chain right off the bat at launch, and that's also a game. And part of that is because they want to incentivize the core community to run all the nodes. And so I think you're going to have a mix here, but I do think that we've sort of strayed in one direction a little bit too much as an industry, and it's become a little bit too acceptable to run, basically a multi-sig as a sequencer for a chain. That's dangerous, effectively, especially depending on the type of content moving through those chains. You're basically serving yourself up to regulators to stop the type of transactions going through there. And depending on what type of chain you built, that might be okay and that might not be okay. So I do think there's a lot to figure out on that front, and I do think decentralization will progress. Number one, as the economic activity of the chain goes up, you'll have more validators that are interested in running nodes. And so that'll be like a reflexive relationship. Or number two, there's a desired security and regulatory cover, and they'll seek validators because of that reason.
Do you have any perspective on, what the value of blockchains are in a non-decentralized world. Like if I just have a blockchain with 10 validators, there's multiple examples of this, or maybe I just have an L2 where I'm the only sequencer. Like what is the value of a blockchain in a world where I launch an L1 or an L2, I'm the only running the validators or the sequencer? Like why not just do it on a regular database? Like how do you think about the value of blockchain in a less decentralized world?
Yeah, I actually think about this a lot, and I think it's two things. One is data consistency. In a world of blockchains where everybody's able to read and write to different smart contracts, it's just simply easier to build on top of somebody else's technology by using a standard effectively. Whereas in the previous world, somebody has to give me access to their API. I need to build something that works with that API that could be foreign to it. In blockchain, it's like, oh, here's their chain. I can read it or I can write to it. If I write to it, I know how to write to this EVM smart contract, for example. And so I do think from a data consistency perspective, that simply will just be a use case that already brings a lot of operational efficiencies to the market that don't exist. But on top of that, there's also this. There's also the element of programmability. And smart contracts provide programmability that a database doesn't. And like Gunzilla is a really good use case. Yes, there's not a lot of nodes, but it's a game where I own my underlying asset and I can prove that I own that asset. Whether or not Gunzilla has the ability to shut down the chain, which I think they do, and in some use cases, like there's a bunch of IP that they own and other things like that. So it's already sort of different than like a public network. But at the end of the day, I can prove that I own these assets, and I can also prove, and I can also transfer them without an intermediary, which I think has always been sort of the interesting use case of blockchain. Permissionless transfer of value is probably the first one that interested me.
So transitioning to the AVAX token itself, I think it's not just unique to AVAX, but I think if you look at Ethereum, Cosmos, a bunch of these network of networks, one of the things people really want to know is how does value actually accrue to the base token itself? I think there's a lot of criticism around Ethereum right now that it's kind of L2s have cannibalized ETH itself. I think there's questions around AVAX, like even in a world where there's 1,000 of these permissionless L1s that launch on the tech stack, how does that actually benefit the AVAX token? So can you help the crowd kind of understand what is the relationship between Avalanche9000, the AVAX token itself, and ultimately, even in a world where there is a proliferation of L1s on top of Avalanche's tech stack, like how does that benefit the token itself, if at all?
Well, this is I can give some broad thoughts that are, I think, objective, and obviously not financial advice in any way. But I'll start with Ethereum. I think it's an interesting one. ETH was basically a DeFi chain for most of its life cycle, and because it was a DeFi chain, it was validators were able to capture a bunch of MEV, burn a bunch of fees. Each transaction had a bunch of content in it, and when transactions have content, there's the ability or the desire for people to bid up block space to arb that out. And when you do that, you generate a lot of fees. But the scaling model for Ethereum is one that removes the content completely and puts it on the L2 layer. So instead, all that MEV and all that content actually is extracted by the sequencer by itself, frankly. And all Ethereum gets is data fee. And data is the most commoditized part of the stack. So, from like a short-term perspective, if you're just taking a view at that, you would say, okay, like this is definitely bearish for the short-term fee generation for this chain. At the same time, if you take a longer-term perspective, I think it was clear that the view was that they would not be able to house a bunch of activity on this one L1 chain. And so therefore it wasn't sustainable. And, in order to build an ecosystem around what they wanted to do, they went down the L2 roadmap, which does generate fees, very small ones, albeit. But I do think that there's sort of this disconnect where all the value was exported from the L1 to the L2s, right? Because if you think about it, let's say you keep a DeFi ecosystem on Ethereum mainnet, you're basically making it any time that Ethereum gets saturated, every L2's fees go up. And if that happens, like you're sort of building a broken system from scratch. And I think that's a challenge, and that's a challenge that they're sort of going through right now. If we want to take that deeper into to other networks, it really goes into sort of what is your thesis about MEV long term? Will MEV be abstracted by the application layer? If so, that's pretty bearish for Solana, right? Because then right now, like that's their fee capture model. So as you sort of have this model where applications will naturally reduce that MEV by abstracting some of that stuff away, then that current narrative that's winning will also sort of like die down. And so for AVAX, for Avalanche, it's kind of both, frankly, especially after Avalanche9000. You have this public permissionless network in the C chain that very much wants to act as a permissionless network, DeFi, consumer crypto, basically startup chain, et cetera, and try to generate MEV and fees. But then you also have the ability to generate passive fee from all the L1s. Every single validator of every single L1 pays a continuous fee to the primary network, albeit a small one. And so you kind of have this dual fee structure that is like part Ethereum, part Solana, that I think is really interesting and is one that's built for a very long-term perspective, but also can capture some of the really juicy fee returns when you have like let's call it a late 2023 moment in crypto, where everything kind of goes crazy on chain. There's a bunch of inscriptions and people are bidding up block space like crazy.
So we're coming up on 2 minutes left. I think you're in a really unique position. You're the COO of a top 7 layer 1 blockchain. You guys are clearly working on some really innovative things with a lot of really interesting partners. What's a unique insight you think you have, given your position in this industry, that you want to share with the audience? Like, what's something you're thinking about? What's something you care about? What's a thought you have that you think you have that's unique from your perspective?
That's a good question. So I think when you've been in this space for a while, a lot of times it can feel like nothing's happening. And you can feel like there's not been a lot of progress. But when you take a step back, and like sometimes I do this myself, and I'm like, okay, it's 2024. In 2020, like the first DeFi app basically launched. Okay, so 4 years, we basically built a whole DeFi economy. Now you have JP Morgan, which has Onyx, using DeFi apps to settle $1 billion a day in tri-party repo. Okay, that's a real use case. That's pretty cool. You also have stable coins like Tether, for example, which are one of the largest holders of treasuries worldwide. So it's like, okay, you take a step back, and there's actually things happening here. But the one thing this space is going to have to reckon with in particular, and it's something that happens much more in bull markets than bear markets, it's going to have to sort of do a better job of capital allocation. Frankly, there's a lot of shitty projects in the space that garner a lot of capital. And the more that happens, the more you're going to sort of put a bad taste in the mouth of new investors, put a bad taste in the mouth of different people who want to get exposure to digital assets, get exposure to some of the new cryptos that are coming along, right? So if there's a bunch of charts that launch and everything's down only forever, that's not a good outcome in my opinion, right? And so the crypto industry is going to have to, sort of reckon with itself, is it always trying to play this PvP game with new outside capital? And if it is, I think that'll be at the expense of longer-term capital that comes in. And so that's something that I think ultimately we'll have to reckon with ourselves. And I really encourage everybody to take a longer-term perspective. Everybody in this industry wants to make $1 million in a day, and I don't think that's really, that's not sustainable. So that's what I'd say.
Well, Luigi, thank you so much. Really interesting learning about Avalanche. Everyone, please give it up for Luigi.
Thanks, you, Joe.